Today we are really honored at IGNOU to have Professor David Crystal here with us at the studios, and for generations to come we will be able to hear his voice and his views. You've agonized a lot about in your book, and I think rightfully so about language death. And in India we have this tradition of grassroots bilingualism,
Yes.
we're proud of it. But yet there are tribal languages that die out. So it's a very real issue in India as well, that this business of language death and language extinction, maintenance. And of course we always suggest to teachers that they should be highly positive towards linguistic groups, which are in a sense minority, and be very positive about the language itself. So any suggestions, because I think this is something that you have in the language revolution really talked about, and that's the first thing that you're worrying about, this death of several languages. What would you suggest to language teachers, to all of us, to do something about?
Absolutely, this is the most important issue of the present age, without a doubt. The internet may be a revolution, but it's a sort of positive revolution in many ways. Language death, yes, the crisis affecting the world's languages. It's extraordinary. There are something like 6,000 languages in the world at the moment. And the estimate is that half of those languages, something like 3,000 languages, are going to die out in the course of this century.
This is a disaster.
It is. It's an unprecedented state of affairs for human language. I mean, imagine it if, in the context of species, of plants and animals, if somebody were to say half the plants and animals of the world are going to die out in this century. Well, it's inconceivable. It could not happen. But if it were to happen, there would be an outcry.
Yes.
And yet, half the languages of the world are so seriously endangered that they're going to die out, and most people don't even know.
Yes.
And the people who know often don't care. And so we all have a massive responsibility here. Because, let's be clear, 3,000 languages in 100 years, that means one language is dying out somewhere in the world every 2 weeks on average. Every 2 weeks there's a language dying somewhere.
Absolutely terrible.
And what can we do? Well, the first thing we can do, and the most important thing we can do, is to make everybody aware of it. The world has to know. If I go outside this studio now and stop the first 10 people in the street and say, are you aware that half the world's languages are dying? Most of them will say no. I did this in London, outside Broadcasting House one day for a radio programme. Nobody, 1 in 4 had an idea. So 3 in 4 had no idea at all. And as a result, the biggest and most important job is to get public awareness of the existence of this crisis. Now, who is responsible for making people aware? There are people like me. I can write books. There are people like you. We can make television programs together. But how many do these reach? Obviously only a limited number. The artists of the world are a very important group here. The people who write the novels and the poems and the short stories. They should be writing novels about language death and language endangerment, and few of them are. The people who write plays should be writing plays about language death. The people who paint pictures should be painting pictures about language death. The people who write symphonies and operas and ballets and dances of all kinds, the jazz musicians of the world, should be having jazz concerts about language death. And few of them are. But of all the people who are important in this respect, I think the teachers are the biggest and most important group, because the teachers have the greatest influence over the children, more than the parents do in relation to intellectual matters of this kind. The way the parents learn about language death is that the child comes home and says, my teacher told me today that half the languages of the world are dying. Really? Says the parent. And now it starts to spread. So the primary role of the teacher is to become, first of all, informed about the language plight of the world. I think probably everybody in India knows about the situation in India, obviously, but do they know about the situation in Brazil, or in Australia, or in North America, where in these cases the Brazilian languages are dying, the Australian Aboriginal languages are dying? Do they know about the situation in Britain, where we have Welsh and Irish and Scottish Gaelic, and these languages are seriously endangered? My other language is Welsh, and that's a language that is surviving quite well, but the language of Scotland and the language of Ireland, they're in very, very serious straits at the moment, and they might not last much longer unless a great deal is done. So it's all a matter of public awareness. Now, what happens when you get public awareness? What's it for? Why make people aware? Well, there's three things that have to happen if you're going to maintain a language, revitalize a language. The first thing, that the people themselves must want it to happen.
Yes.
And that doesn't always happen, you know. In some parts of the world, the people do not care. They say, oh, well, we'll lose our language, we'll learn English, because that way we'll get a better job or something. And of course there's a validity in that.
Yes.
But you see, you can learn English without losing your other language. The world is essentially a multilingual place. We're all by nature multilingual beings. And to have 2 or 3 or 4 languages is of course familiar in multilingual India. In some parts of the world it's a bit of a surprise. But maintaining 2 languages at the same time is very important. People have to believe this, they have to want to keep their local language. So there has to be a bottom-up mood for preserving language, and the teachers can help foster that. There also has to be a top-down mood. In other words, local government has to be in favour of it, national government has to be in favour of it, and international government has to be in favour of it. Now, at the international level, this mood exists. UNESCO, the Council of Europe, and many other organizations now have charters in place saying that minority languages must be maintained, that local identities must be respected.
Yes.
And this is great to see this.
Yes.
So top-down movement has to be there, because without it, the third factor is not present. And the third factor is cash.
Yes.
It's expensive maintaining minority languages. Very expensive in the short term. You have to train teachers. You have to publish books for the children to read. It's the children that are the crucial thing, because after all, it's the children that are the parents of the next generation of children. And unless they speak the language will die out within a generation. So cash is needed to maintain a community and educational climate within which the language can be fostered. Now, some people say, some governments say, we haven't got the money. Well, I say to them, if you don't put the money in now, you will lose a lot of money in a few years' time. Because in a few years' time, the people who have lost their language, or who are beginning to realize that their language is disappearing, begin to get angry. And you have seen this in India as much as anywhere, more than anywhere else in the world.
More than anywhere else.
Absolutely. People who get angry about the loss of their language. And when they get angry, then there's trouble. And when there's trouble, there is damage and danger and loss of life. And that's expensive. So to pay in the short term for preserving identity in the long term is a very valuable investment, it seems to me.
Yes, true. And I think this might take place because in the Asian countries, they're becoming economically stronger. You know, China, for instance, one can't deny these days. India as well is emerging as a strong economy. So do you think that might, in a sense, because of course the main languages will remain, but even smaller parts of China, maybe people need to do business with them. So do you think that will impact English as well? Because it may not be the case that it is the onus of the Asian countries to sort of be intelligible, but it may be the onus of, say, the Americans as well to be they also need the Chinese in a sense. So they also would have to either learn Chinese, maybe, if the world order changes to that extent, or they may have to sort of speak a Chinese English to make themselves intelligible to the Chinese.
Yes.
So do you think the economics is going to play that kind of a role?
Economics is a crucial consideration in language change, more so than politics. I mean, politics originally was important, and still is to some extent, but it's economy that drives the world. It's money that talks. You know, that's the idiom, isn't it? Money talks.
Yes.
Which language does it talk, therefore? So there is that correlation. Now, we have to be clear that intelligibility is one of the two criteria which drive the languages of the world along and give them a ranking of high and low. But intelligibility is not the only force that drives language. Identity is the other force that drives language. We need to identify ourselves as well as to be intelligible. I, as sitting here, want to understand you, and want you to understand me. So we use a standard form of English that we have both learned.
Yes.
As a child, I did not speak standard English. Nor probably as a child did you.
Yes.
But we've learnt it because we need a standard. Otherwise we'll never be sitting here talking to each other. As a child, I learnt a local dialect of English. First of all, a Welsh English, because I was brought up in Wales, a mixture of English with lots of Welsh words in it, and then the second part of my life I lived in Liverpool, and we all know from the Beatles how different Liverpool English is from anywhere else, not standard English at all. And if you think about it, something like 98% of the English language speakers of the world actually speak non-standard English.
Yes.
Standard English is only heard on television channels and radio channels and in Parliament and in the law courts and in a few other places like this, satellite radio and satellite television.
Yes.
Most people don't speak standard English. They speak their own local variety of English. And so identity is a very important force. Sitting here now, I, in my head, actually have 3 or more varieties of English. I'm using standard English now. When I go back home, when I leave India, I'll relax into my local dialect of English when I'm talking to local people who speak that dialect. So I am already bi-dialectal. In fact, I'm tri-dialectal because I have my Liverpool English in there as well.
Yes.
And in a sense, I'm quadri-dialectal because when I'm abroad, speaking internationally, I don't actually use as many British expressions as I would use as if I were lecturing in Britain. I remember once going to America, and somebody was talking to me about a topic, and they made a good response. And I said, oh, you played that with a straight bat, I said. You played that with a straight bat. Now in India everybody will understand what that means because cricket drives you as it drives me. But in America they went, huh? You know, what do you mean, play that with a straight bat? I mean, well, what is that? And I explained what it was, that it was a metaphor from cricket. And then the man said, oh, that came out of left field. And I said, what do you mean? Because, you see, that was a metaphor from baseball, which I don't understand. And so, internationally, we tend not to use idioms like that. I try not to, because they may not be understood. And so my international English is different from my standard British English, which is different from my Liverpool English, which is different from my Welsh English. Now, in the world, that is the norm. Everybody has this kind of multiple ability. In your case, you have not only different levels of English that you could use, you have your mother tongue and maybe other languages that are also available for you to implement. And I see the future of the world as becoming an increasingly, not just multilingual world, as globalization makes us contact each other, but an increasingly multi-dialectal world as well. And we are all going to end up in English in 100 years' time, having control of 2 or 3 different dialects of English. A world English for international purposes, a local English, Indian English, American English, and so on, for our own national purposes. And then perhaps our local dialects of English, depending on where we come from. And of course, within all that, Chinese English, Singaporean English, Ghanaian English, Nigerian English, Swedish English, and all of these other things are going to grow. That is indeed, I think, the future of English.
Yes, but as teachers again, because again we are all teachers.
Not a good time to be a teacher.
not really not a good time to be a teacher. A great time to be a sociolinguist.
Oh yes, absolutely.
We want to have our cake and eat it too. So we want to, be multi-dialectal where English is concerned, but we also want to have some kind of a pedagogical norm.
Yes, of course. You want to have your cake and eat it, and so you should, and so you shall. I mean, and this is how you have your cake and eat it. You recognize the two functions of language, the intelligibility function and the identity function. Now, for teaching purposes, the intelligibility function is primary, and therefore nothing that I've said should suggest to teachers that they stop or change their methods of teaching standard English. Whatever standard English they have taught in the past, if it's British standard English or American standard English or in Australian standard English or whatever it might be, they carry on doing that because that guarantees that the children will be able to talk and write intelligibly on the world stage. In any case, you have no alternative. The materials are all in standard English,
yes.
The examination system is standard English, and therefore, as far as production is concerned, then indeed the speaking and writing will continue as before. But as far as listening comprehension is concerned, and reading comprehension is concerned, then it is very important that teachers expose their students as early as possible to the variety of Englishes that exist in the world. Otherwise, you have the disastrous situation of a child leaving a teacher's care and going out into the big wide world thinking that everybody speaks and writes standard English, and they don't.
Yes.
Everybody speaks non-standard English. So what is the child going to do? Go around saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong.
Yes.
You can't do that.
Yes.
What you should do is say, it's a world of flowers, linguistic flowers out there. Your linguistic flower, you speak that way. Your linguistic flower, you speak that way. This is wonderful, a place to bathe in linguistically. But standard English is uniting us all.
Yes.
So the more, I think, one can get some experience of non-standard Englishes in the world, the more you are prepared for a world that is becoming increasingly diverse. Now, interestingly, these days, it is possible to get this kind of exposure easily. A few years ago, it was very difficult. But now, with television, with DVDs, with video, with world cinema being the way it is, with the internet now allowing us access to every conceivable variety of written English there is in the world, then I think it's much easier for a teacher to say, no, standard English is the norm for you, but notice all these different variants. And the more confident you become, the more you can, if you wish, dip your toe into these different variants and slip a little bit of non-standard English into your speech if you want. So I might say to you at one point, we ain't seen nothing yet.
Yes.
Now, because I say that, you don't say, oh dear, that was bad English.
Yes.
No, what you sense is, I am deliberately being non-standard to make a joke. And that is a very confident control of the language, isn't it? Well, that's what we want the children to do, to be able to control their standard and non-standard. If we think of it as clothing once again, the standard suit of clothes, the non-standard suit of clothes. Today, I have the choice, I have the power to choose. Today I will be standard. But occasionally when I'm with my friends, or I can be non-standard. And it's that power that's so important.
Yes, one last question. You talked of, it's going to be an increasingly multilingual world. And in fact, Dr. Pandit years and years ago said that our tongue, the Indian tongue, is perhaps the bilingual tongue. Our mother tongue is the bilingual tongue, and in fact we code switch all the time, and this is a very unnatural situation for me to only be speaking in English. With Rajani I would code switch all the time.
Of course you would.
Yeah.
And so do most people in the world. I mean, code switching is such a universal and natural phenomenon. It is amazing, really, that it has been sidelined so much. Well, it's not amazing when you think of history. The only reason that people have been dismissive of code switching is because they have been led to believe that a standard language is the only kind of language. There is this purist mentality which grew up in Britain in the 18th century, which meant that people thought of English as being one kind of English only. And this was the English that was going to rule the world, you see. So therefore anything that wasn't perfect British formal English was incorrect in some way. Gutter talk. And you're mixing up lots of foreign words in it. Oh dear, that's bad. Well, we've gone beyond that stage, I hope. And the situation around the world is that code switching is absolutely normal. It turns up in every language, in every society, in some shape or form. The more multilingual a society, the more code switching there is. And the value of code switching is phenomenal, because it means that you have not just one level of expressiveness, but three. You see, if I speak English, I have one level of expressiveness. If I speak Hindi, I have another level of expressiveness. If I speak a sort of Hinglish and mix the two together, I have a third type of expressiveness. I can make jokes in Hinglish that I could not make in Hindi and not make in English. And this is happening all over in Singapore with Singlish, the same sort of thing. English and Chinese mixed there. And somebody speaking Singlish can produce a whole different world of humour and expressiveness and poetry. You see, this is not any longer just a matter of low kind of communication, in the sense that it's just used for domestic purposes. There are now poems written in code switching. There are novels written in code switching. Even in British English alone you can see it all the time. Some of the most famous novels in the last few years, the ones that win the prizes, the Booker Prize winners, and you look at them, are they written in standard English? No, they are not. Trainspotting by Irving Welsh, written in a major kind of regional Scottish English, but with standard English every now and again. So it's code switching throughout that. And that it's almost impossible to have a modern novel these days without some amount of code switching within it. So where does India stand in all of this? Well, I see India actually as being a future centre of gravity for the English language. Not just statistically, because I think there is already more speakers of English in India than anywhere else, but because of the nature of the linguistic mix in India is indicative of the way the world is going as a whole. You were there first. And the reason why India is so important is that when these new Englishes come into being, they express identity in a curiously cultural kind of way. You remember the example about the American not understanding my cricket metaphor and I not understanding? Well, this happens all over the world. When you go to South Africa, you immediately encounter a wide range of South African English that is not used outside of South Africa. A dictionary of South African English has 10,000 words in it, from Zulu and Afrikaans, that are not used anywhere else in the world. A dictionary of Indian English has thousands of words in it, going right back to Hobson, Jobson and before, that are not used anywhere else in the world. To understand them, you have to understand the culture that gave rise to them. Now, how do you do that? How do you develop techniques for handling this? The best place to do it is in a place that has been doing it for years. And where else has been doing it for years other than India? I mean, hundreds of years. You have had that couple of 100 years start on, say, China. I mean, China is now, teaching English to everybody as fast as it can. And you might say then, well, Chinese English is going to become or Chinese-influenced English is going to become a majority stakeholder in the future of English. And so it will. But you see, you're so far ahead of the Chinese as far as being aware of the culture of English is concerned. You know about English culture, British culture, because you were part of it for so long. You know about American culture because nobody can avoid American culture. But the poor Chinese, you see, they're learning English as fast as they can, but they now have to learn the cultural side that is second nature to so many people in India. And in South Asia generally. And so therefore I think that India has this special role to play. I see it as a bridge between native speakers of English the British, the Americans, the Australians and so on, and foreign learners of English like the Chinese, the Japanese and so on, India has this special place as a bridge between native and non-native speakers of English.
Yes, and truly, as you say in your book, The Language Revolution, it is not a lad world merely, it is a mad world.
A mad world, yes. A world where we have an acquisition device, yes. Chomsky's old term, a language acquisition device. Chomsky was wrong in one, he was right in one respect, he was wrong in another. What we have in here is a multilingual acquisition device, a MAD. We're all born with a scanner in there which is saying, give me languages, give me languages, give me languages.
Yes, yes.
And the more languages we have, the more human we become.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So much more tolerance and so much more affection.
Well, at the end of the day, that's what language learning is all about.
Yes.
Why do we learn a foreign language?
Yes.
Because we want to be more human.
Yes.
Not just because we want to speak it for its own sake, it's because we want to talk to other people. And if we talk to them and understand them, we respect them more, we become more tolerant, we become fuller human beings.
Yes.
It's an old saying, the world is a mosaic of visions, and each language expresses an individual vision. And the more languages I know, the more visions I have,
yes.
and the fuller human being I become.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor David Crystal. It is indeed, once again, a real honor that you are here. And I can't, in words cannot express my gratitude. Thank you so much.
Well, I have to say I am grateful too, because the opportunity of talking to you like this and with such a wide audience potentially seeing the program one day, it's been a delight. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you.